I'm speaking with Hollie McKay, author of Only Cry for the Living, Memos from Inside the ISIS Battlefield, published March 22nd, 2021 by Jocko Publishing and D'Angelo Publications. Thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you for having me.
So first, how did you get into doing this work and writing a book on ISIS battlefields?
Right. So actually, journalism wasn't something I really thought that I would go into. I always loved to write. As a child, I was always writing and creating, and I was actually a ballet dancer. And I went away very young to pursue that career and ended up breaking my ankle. So that set me back a little bit. I went back to university in Sydney, got a bit restless. And so when I was 20, I decided to finish my degree in New York. And I went to New York. That was in 2006. So the digital era was just growing. And people were talking about these internships. And we didn't really have those in Australia. So I was very curious. And I applied at a bunch of places online. And I ended up getting a call from Fox. And they hired me in their digital department. So it was a really cool chance to use my writing to learn about this sort of digital phenomenon right in the kind of beginning phases of it. And then at the end, I was sponsored and shuffled off to Los Angeles to begin a journalism career. It was a little bit baptism by fire. I had to just kind of go out there and meet people and find stories. And it was a very different time, I guess. It was sort of pre-Twitter, Facebook was around, but nobody was really using it. And so, you had to sort of nourish that on the ground sense of journalism. And I just was a deeply curious person. And I loved the idea of getting to the bottom of something. And so as my career progressed through my 20s, I just couldn't really get my head around the situation of what was happening overseas. And I wanted to really take these things and these wars and these complexities. And I just felt that everything we were hearing was in a very macro sense. We were hearing about numbers and statistics. And I wanted to understand what it was like for people on the ground. And I wanted to take, I guess, a micro approach and really focus on those human stories. And so the first couple of trips, I just felt that I was in my right place when I was doing it. And, you're in the middle of chaos. And yet for me, I felt very calm because I felt that I was in my calling. And I felt that if I could do this work, I should do this work.
Did you was Mosul your first stop in Iraq, or did you take sort of baby steps getting
no, I was all in. So my first trip in Iraq specifically was in 2014. So not long after ISIS had sort of swept in suddenly and taken over Mosul and a lot of the areas surrounding it. So when I decided to go in, I made a lot of connections in advance and we're talking to different people in positions, especially in the north, in the Kurdish area. And I kind of went in there very early and just, once you meet one person, it's a snowball effect and somebody else wants to tell their story and somebody else wants to tell their story. And then the next thing you know, I was only there for a couple of days and I was on the front line and talking to the Peshmerga soldiers there. So it was just a very kind of surreal, fast, again, it was another time of baptism by fire because suddenly you just have to be in the belly of the beast and you learn as you go.
Who did you have to get permission from to travel there? I guess the U.S. State Department.
Nope. So at that point you get it varies. Obviously, when you're in Baghdad, you get visas, but at that point in the north, you could get a sort of a visa at arrival or a temporary stay, and you didn't need to get paperwork in advance necessarily. But in any of the trips I've done, I don't get permission from the US State Department. If I require a visa, I go to the embassy of that particular country, but none of my work requires permission from the US to be there, I think. And that's important because journalism shouldn't be requiring government permissions.
Yeah, actually, I'm sorry. You're Australian, so
I'm both Australian and American.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So the book itself, talk about what it covers, the years and what you focus on.
Yeah, so it goes from 2014 and then really through to sort of the end of 2018, beginning of 2019.
Mhm.
And they were the real rise and fall years of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And so I really wanted to get as many perspectives as possible. And so that entailed, and it is chronological, but it also entails talking to people from every side. So there's a lot of interviews with terrorists in there, as well as ISIS wives, children that have been brainwashed into the fold,
Mhm.
Yazidis who survived sex slavery,
Mhm.
old people who've been kidnapped and tortured, also the perspective of US generals, the perspective of Syrian fighters, the perspective of Iraqi politicians and Kurdish politicians. So I really just wanted to paint a very comprehensive picture from every perspective possible and just take the reader along to the battlefield with me and to really bring to life the consequences of war and what it's like to live through these things day in and day out.
Mhm. Who helped you get around? Who gave you information or escorted you around in the dangerous areas?
That was very much on me to figure out logistics, and that's always a lot harder than the actual work on the ground often. So I'd be tearing my hair out from my homes in LA or when I moved to New York, just trying to meet one person, connect with one person, and put together some kind of rough schedule. But in terms of when I was getting around, it really depended on where I was and what I was doing. For example, if I was in the Kurdish area and was going to the front line, I would often be with the Peshmerga soldiers, and they were sort of tasked to protect you and take care of you. So I would be going with them, or if I was further south in Baghdad, I would either just be with my fixer, who we as journalists we hire people that we call fixers, and they're generally local journalists or local workers, and they help to facilitate interviews and logistics and drivers and that kind of thing. They really do angel work. They're amazing. We wouldn't be able to do our job without them. So
Mhm.
sometimes I'm just kind of going with them. So it really depends, mission by mission. But I don't go in with security guards or with big teams. I think that's sort of a lovely thing about being a writer for me is I enjoy that independence. I like being able to go in under the radar. I feel like I'm a little bit more secure that way than I would be if I sort of had a bunch of burly guys around me. I think
Mhm.
the more I can blend in, that works for me. So it is daunting, and there are definitely times where I felt, oh my gosh, wouldn't it be nice to have a just one other a colleague or somebody with me, a photographer. Instead, it's just me and my iPhone.
Mhm.
But I really rely on the locals and trusted locals, and you've got to vet them as best you can and hope for the best. And I've always had really amazing luck with the people I've worked with on the ground.
So in this kind of work, did you have any episodes where you got maybe dangerously close to, the shooting and that sort of thing?
Yeah. I mean, there were definitely times. I remember one morning waking up. I was in Sinjar City after the liberation, and it was a completely bombed out city. And nobody was living there except that it was a military base for the Yazidi soldiers. And I sort of was sleeping on a basically an abandoned roof. And we woke up one morning and there was a lot of heavy shelling, and the whole city was just surrounded by bombing. And then the coalition kind of came in, and so you have this. I guess it's a fear because, as I said, I don't tell the US where I am. I don't, alert officials that I'm going to be here or there because I do think that takes away from my role as a journalist.
Mhm.
So you never know, when and if you can also be a target. So that's also something I have to factor into consideration as well. But
Mhm.
for me, I think I've always taken great, or I've always felt very calm because the people that I am surrounded by, I feel like they live through this day in and day out, and they get through it. And to me, that I was never going to panic. It's healthy to feel some sense of fear, but not to panic. And I just felt that, who was I to ever complain or to want to run away when these people survive it day in and day out. So they're the real kind of heroes to me.
So when you were starting your information gathering in 2014, did you think you'd end up writing a book about 2014, or how did it end up taking 4 or 5 years?
Yeah, and I wasn't sure. I mean, I always thought it would be nice to somehow capture some of the moments, but I wasn't sure at that point the best way to do that. And so it really wasn't until about 2016, and I looked in my cupboard and I had about 20 or so of these black notebooks just filled with my scribble in there. And I am kind of an old school journalist in the sense that I didn't really go in and record. I like to sit with people. I like to sit and sip tea and spend hours with them and talk to them about their families and their lives, and kind of take notes. And so I also really like to pay attention to detail. So the expressions on the faces, the colors that they're wearing, the smells, I think those things are really compelling in bringing readers in. But so I would take all these notes, and I really wasn't quite sure what I was going to do with them. And then it wasn't until 2016, and I looked at these notebooks, and I was still in the middle of going back and forth. And I just thought, what I need to do is just to put together some of these notes into some kind of legible form, but still keep it as raw as I could. And I didn't want to polish things too much because I wanted things to be sort of that run-on sensibility that you're in there. So that was sort of how it came to be. And the logical way for me to structure that, I think, was in what I call memos, which is different slices and different stories throughout the time, focusing on different aspects. And I think hopefully that does enable that comprehensive picture, but also there's sort of something in there for everyone. So there are some memos that are focused on the idea of being on the front line and what happens there. And then there are other memos when you're with women who are surviving and mothers just trying to get by. So I hope that there's sort of there's something in there that we all can relate to.
I'm speaking with Hollie McKay, author of Only Cry for the Living. You can find more information about her work at holliemckay.com. If you like this episode of Military History Inside Out so far, please tap the like button and bullseye the subscribe button. If you want more interviews with military historians or to get daily history book suggestions, check out WarScholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you want interviews with writers and creative people or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out fullcontactnerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you want to hear interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com and my podcast, Technology and Space. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video. So how did you choose the individuals or the roles, maybe not the specific people, but the roles that you wanted to talk to people about, the soldiers, the victims, maybe, I don't know if you dealt with people, arms smugglers, or tell me the breadth of the width and breadth.
Yeah, and I wanted to just, I had so much material, and unfortunately there's still so much material I had to leave out. It's a 400+ page book, but I think for me, my role was to sort of take a step back and to allow people to have their own voice and to present stories without a sort of a political edge or a certain bias. You have to insert yourself a little bit into the narrative because I think that's also important. But I really wanted this book not to be about me and what I thought of a situation or how I felt, but really how they felt, what it's like day in and day out, and just sort of the nuances and the things that we don't realize and the struggles that people go through. And how do you tell your child why they have to run from their house, or how do you tell them why they're being persecuted based on their faith or their religion? And I just think these are the small things that always piqued my curiosity. And I think that I wanted to bring attention to those kind of details in these situations that can really give us just a stronger understanding of the consequences of war and what the civilians caught in the crossfire have to endure. But at the same time, I also felt that it was important to interview terrorists and terrorist wives and people that are on the other side, because I think if we don't get a comprehensive understanding of where their mind is at and the reasons why they join these particular groups and the motivations and how, I guess, leadership structures unfold, then we're never really going to understand it. I think that is also a problem that we encounter, is that, or all sides encounter, is that nobody's listening to each other. So journalism can be a kind of bridge for different viewpoints to be heard, and maybe for people in different unwearing parties to understand the other's point of view without actually having that direct line of communication.
As a female reporter, what challenges did you have interviewing terrorists, getting in touch with them?
It wasn't actually. Always found being a woman in a lot of these places is actually an advantage, because I had, I guess, access to 100% of the population that a lot of male journalists, they can't go and sit with the women necessarily and talk about a lot of the horrific stuff for cultural reasons. But for me, I was kind of perceived as this third gender sort of role, where they don't expect you to necessarily have to adhere to the norms of the women there, but you are given this kind of honorary status that enables you to go back and forth in between. Mm-hmm. So I think, surprisingly enough, that was sort of how a lot of the terrorists viewed it too, is that I wasn't necessarily, I wasn't going to be, subject to the regulations that they would subject their own women to. But I was a Western woman, which they were aware of, and I was always very transparent about, what I was doing, and that I wasn't there to interrogate them. I was there to interview them, and this was their chance to answer some questions and have a chance to tell their side, which I'm sure that they rarely get. And many of them are often, chomping at the bit to have their say. So I think that was also important. And I think once you are transparent enough that you aren't there for any other reason but journalism, I think that they're willing to sort of treat you with a level of respect.
So I'm sure at some points people were telling you things that maybe they did or that they believed that were distasteful to you or in opposition to how you felt. What methods or in what ways did you just kind of make sure you didn't interject your own feelings?
And that's the importance of compartmentalizing it too. And I have to do a lot of mental work, I think, before I walk into a situation to kind of distance myself a little bit from the narrative. And I mean, let's face it, you're going to go into an interview with anyone, and if you're going to be immediately very hostile and very brash and want to stick it to the man, you're really not going to get great answers. And so, again, being a writer, I wasn't there to sort of try to get this sort of TV and this kind of conflict. I was there to have a conversation. So I basically sort of had to go in there, separate myself from what was happening, and just treat it as if I was talking to. And I think there was a certain level that it takes a little bit to warm up, a little bit to get into the mode. At first, I think I always maybe a little indignant, and then eventually the conversation seems to flow a little bit once you develop that rapport. But I do remember in a couple of sort of situations, and one in particular, interviewing an ISIS bomb maker in a prison, and he was brought in and he was blindfolded and shackled, but they took his blindfold off when he was talking to me. And one of my friends who is Kurdish and obviously had suffered a lot under ISIS's takeover, I felt him, getting extremely hostile next to me and really angry and starting to translate in a really angry manner. And I had to just ask him to leave the room because that was interfering with my, ability to do the interview. But, I also understand how emotional those experiences are for the people that have to live again through this day in and day out, and the hatred that they rightfully so have against these terrorists. And it's very difficult, I think, for them to be sitting in front of it. But for me, that compartmentalizing is extremely important.
How do you deal with situations maybe when you doubted some facts that someone was telling you, maybe they made claims that you weren't sure about? Were you able to fact check things like that?
Definitely, to the best of my ability. For example, if I was interviewing an ISIS fighter or an ISIS wife, and I would then always go and talk to some local intelligence officials, as well as police guards, whoever was kind of overseeing them day in and day out, prison guards and try to sort of corroborate as much information as I can. Some of them, if they'd already been trialed, it was a little easier because there was a lot more court documents that you could kind of get to try to back up things that were said and done. Again, you can only rely on your sources and vet absolutely to the best of your ability. And it's often hard in those places because there's language barriers, there's rules and regulations and different things. But I think it's important to never take these things at face value and do your best to try to get to the bottom of what's happening. But at the same time, what also makes it difficult is that, again, it's such an emotional issue that you can be dealing with intelligence and security officials, and they also have their own agendas as well. And it's ISIS obviously affected them and they're personally affected by it. So you have to bear in mind that everybody is sort of coming at it with a certain sense of personal bias. And I think that's why it's also important to have outside journalists that can kind of come in and deflect those situations a little bit. I think sometimes too, if you're only relying on the journalism that's done on the ground and the local journalism, which is extremely important, but the picture again is going to be a lot different to the picture that perhaps an outsider can kind of come in with a little bit more of a neutral slate.
Mm-hmm. Were there instances where you ended up not by choice, but ended up part of a story or part of an incident? Maybe you were asked, hey, can you help us move this person who's been injured or something like that?
I mean, you're always, I guess, to a degree, you're part of a story. You're going into people's homes and you're living with them. And certainly I'm a human before I'm a journalist. So anytime anyone was in desperate need of anything, I did whatever I could to try to help them. But I think, it's always frustrating because you're limited to what you can do as well. And I think a lot of the time these people are in desperate need of doctors and psychiatrists and weapons and money and all these sorts of things. And so I can only give so much. And that's always, a feeling that I struggle with a little bit in terms of guilt. But I'm definitely not the journalist that says, oh, I can't lift you or I can't help you. I do try to, even if it's just sitting with a person for as long as I can and listening to them or taking their child to the market, or that's part of being in people's lives. That's part of the journalism that I try to do in terms of just being with people and staying with people and really trying to understand life from their purview.
Mm-hmm. Were there the U.S. Presence in Iraq, I guess in 2014, it was really low, and then it just started to grow up again as ISIS grew. Were you able to talk to U.S. personnel at all, or any U.S.?
Yeah, definitely. In the beginning, it was a lot more difficult. I think the US was a lot more sort of hidden in its first few months, and the presence was definitely in the shadows. But over time, I spent a bit of time in Baghdad with US troops and then with some Australian troops as well, and kind of moved around and also went to a couple of their bases in the north, in Erbil, and also in Syria. I saw some of the US troops there as well. So I definitely tried to get their perspective. I was in communication with a lot of the Pentagon spokespeople quite frequently, and tried to paint their perspective as much as possible. And there's quite a bit of that in the book as well, as sort of the generals when they were talking about just in the months after the Mosul liberation and the challenges that came from that, and the importance of having a clear mandate. I think for them, whether you agreed with it or not, the mandate was that ISIS needed to be defeated. And I know that there are a lot of foreign policy people who wanted that to be a little bit more broad. They wanted to include perhaps the Iranian-backed militias or this Assad regime to be taken out. There was a lot of other things at play. But the mandate from the US side was very clear that ISIS needed to be defeated. And in some ways, I think that was achieved because it was a very clear vision that the commander-in-chief gave. And I think that was carried out.
Was there any point during this span of years when you came across a place that you had been to before, maybe you hadn't been to, but you were familiar with it in some way, that you were shocked by a change or something new that was going on? Like, you're a reporter, you expect change, but was there any point where you were just struck? by what you encounter?
I would almost say the lack of change struck me more than any change. And so I think a lot of the people that I met very early on in my journalism there, who'd been displaced from their homes, would run from their homes, and then I'd go back in and over time and find that they were still displaced, and that the situation had become even more unbearable for them, and the funding had dried up. And of course, when ISIS is no longer headline news, so therefore the funding does go away, and the situation actually becomes worse for a lot of these people because they still can't go home. Their homes are still in ruins, demolished to the ground. They haven't been rebuilt. And so there really isn't anywhere for them to go but to stay in these camps. And they're staying in these camps with tents that haven't been replaced for 4 years, despite the many changes of seasons and the challenges that come from that. And so for me, it's kind of shocking to see the situation deteriorating even more when you think it can't get any worse, and it does. And that's been a really sad aspect of this war is sort of seeing that. And the longer time goes on, the more the situation is only going to get worse for them, and the less money that's going to be devoted to that cause in particular. And I think that's really sad to me.
I get the impression with some of these refugee camps that you generally have organized crime take over, or some strong man or a strong element that's unsavory, I guess is maybe the word to use. Do you see that? Did you see that in these war zones where?
Yeah, I mean, refugee or displacement camps, they're always going to be challenging places, and a lot of those dynamics are going to carry over. They're often very unsafe places as well, especially for women. And I think that, that again, it comes down to how much security and how many resources can be provided in a lot of these places, and basic setups. Often, it's the sort of the simple things that really baffled me, where you'd go to a place where certain women were so far away from the latrines, and that's a really dangerous trek at night for a woman to have to walk in the dark by herself without any functioning lights to latrines on the other side of the camp. And so it's sort of little logistical things like that always sort of surprise me, that can make a big difference in terms of the safety aspect of it. But yeah, you always are going to have concerns over cells or concerns over infiltration, and it's an unsecure place for people to be. And I think there's just this constant sense of what I can only imagine for a lot of these people is that there really isn't a safe place to go. Home is not safe. The camps are not safe. Getting on a boat and trying to go overseas is not safe. So it's a really sad, exhausting feeling.
Mm-hmm. So I get the sense, just to correct me here, so it sounds like you were primarily in Mosul, and then you went to some other areas as well. Is that correct? Or is it more?
It was all over the place. Honestly, it was, I spent a lot of time in the north in the Erbil area. I'd go kind of up further toward Dahuk, which is kind of closer to where sort of Turkey, Syria, and Iraq all meet. And then I would be out in Sinjar, which is again, is further east toward the Syrian border. The town of Talafa, also down near the Syrian border, and then Mosul. I spent a bit of time in Baghdad as well, and then even further south of Baghdad, which is a lot more of a sort of a stringent religious Shia aspect to it. That was sort of the time in Iraq, and then Syria was also a mixed bag. I would spend time in Kobani and a lot of the very Kurdish dominant areas. And then as far off as sort of Manbij and Deir ez-Zor, which are a lot more Arab dominant, and a lot of where the heavy ISIS fighting was happening as well. So I kind of moved around a lot. It was sort of, living out of my backpack for a long time.
Mm-hmm. And did you do the where you wearing your Kevlar helmet and vest and that kind of stuff when you went about?
Yeah, in certain places. I only really do that when I have to, if I know that I'm going to be on a front line. Otherwise, if I'm just sort of regularly cruising around or going into people's homes, I, again, often, well, pretty much none of them have the have their own body armor. So I certainly don't want to go into somebody's home for tea, even if it is a dangerous situation, wearing my body armor. I try to be, I guess, as normalized with them as I can. So yeah, the body armor, it's always around, but I only try to wear it in situations that really require me to wear it. Otherwise, it can can weigh you down too. I think even some front lines that are a little bit more tricky to get to, where you have to, take wagons up hills or horses and that kind of thing. You can't take your body armor because it will only weigh you down when you've got to be able to maneuver around fairly easily. So it's all situation by situation.
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Hollie McKay, author of Only Cry for the Living. You can find more information about her work at holliemckay.com. If you like this episode of Military History Inside Out so far, please tap the like button and bullseye the subscribe button. If you want more interviews with military historians or to get daily history book suggestions, check out WarScholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you want interviews with writers and creative people or daily book suggestions in sci-fi, fantasy, horror, film history, gaming, and more, check out FullContactNerd.com and my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews. If you want to hear interviews with space scientists, space historians, and technology experts, or get daily space and science book suggestions, check out technologyandspace.com and my podcast, Technology and Space. All of my social media links are listed at the end of this episode. Now back to the video.
So this question is about the people involved in fighting on any side. Was there anything that struck you as surprising or unusual, maybe the ages or their attitudes or their approaches to fighting?
I think what was always fascinating, especially with the Kurds, was the sheer age range that you're looking at. So you really have these sort of multi-generation of fighters, and the Kurds and the Peshmerga are just, they're so clear about what they're fighting for, and they're really fighting for this idea of Kurdistan, and they're fighting for this idea of independence and this extremely patriotic to their homeland. And so that was phenomenal to me, because you can be in a unit with somebody who's 18 years old, and then so his brothers that are in their 20s, and then their father who's in his 40s, and then his father who's in his 60s or 70s, and I believe there were some men that were sort of fighting into their 80s as well, that were just volunteering and grabbing their AK-47 from home and donning whatever camouflage they could get and just getting into the fight because they felt that strongly about their country and fighting for it. The Iraqi army is obviously a little bit more structured than that. And so they tend to skew a little bit younger, especially with their special forces and things, because there's a little bit more structure, I guess, to them. But what I admired a lot about the Iraqis was, I think in the beginning, they were very, I guess, humiliated when so many of them abandoned their post and ran when ISIS came into Mosul in June 2014. But what was remarkable to me was watching them over the course of the 4 years just really grow into this incredibly patriotic, strong, and capable force. And they had this kind of oomph to them that I didn't see in the beginning. And that was really nice to watch them want to fight for their country and find reason to fight for their country. And I thought that was sort of a remarkable trajectory and a really welcome one.
What about the women that you spoke to? What were their attitudes towards the fighting? Did they just want the war to stop, or did they express sort of an understand or a desire for victory or whatever?
I think, again, it's dependent, but I met some remarkable women who were fighting. There was one group called the Sun Ladies in the Kurdish region. They were all Yazidis. And so so many of them had been taken as sex slaves and returned, or their mothers or their sisters or their daughters were taken. And so one of them, her name was Khatun, decided that she wanted to create her own fighting force. And they were all women, and they were just remarkable. They called themselves the Sun Ladies, and none of them had really had any experience. And they were shattering all these taboos, and they were getting weapons and training with the men, and they wanted to be part of liberating Sinjar, which is the Yazidi area, and really take an active role in that fight, and continue to take an active role in that fight. And I think that was twofold. There's part of it, of course, that wants to seek a certain level of revenge against the people that have committed absolute atrocities against them. And then there's this idea of empowerment too, of reasserting their value and reasserting their strength. And I think being part of that fight in a very physical sense was really important to them. And so it was really incredible to spend time with them. And there were several groups like that. A lot of the women in Syria are very active on the front lines. And there are other Yazidis, which sort of initially were kind of like a National Guard or border patrol. And now that when ISIS came in, they took a lot more of an active role in the fight too. So I think it really showed, I guess, the strength of women and them really wanting to be very viscerally in the action.
Mm-hmm. Is there, considering the atrocities, are people able to, I'm thinking in terms of Geneva Convention, are people able to take prisoners and treat them kindly? Or my feeling is that on both sides, if whoever's taken prisoner is just going to suffer.
Yeah.
Is that what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, ISIS is certainly not going to recognize anything to do with the Geneva Convention. Their whole objective was going back to this idea of the caliphate, which was definitely did not entail any Geneva Convention. So that's also a challenge for countries that do adhere to those rules and rules of engagement, because you are fighting enemies a lot of the time that don't have such rules and sort of restrictions and can do what they want. And ISIS certainly was incredibly brutal in its treatment of prisoners. So it definitely didn't show any kind of sense of remorse or adherence to any of what we would consider to be international norms or a sense of justice. So they very much run things by their own rules. But having said that, they were a surprisingly structured organization. They had, I remember finding prisoner files from them, and they were very much like prisoner files that you would find in an ordinary government, with sort of photos and dates of births and causes of arrest and conviction dates and sentencing dates. And it was structured. And I think that's what enabled ISIS to succeed so much, was that they were able to effectively govern to some degree, and they weren't just sort of a ragtag militia.
Mm-hmm. And on the Iraqi side or the other side, I guess that my question was more aimed at them. Did you see proper treatment, or did you see situations that were not?
I think, I mean, we can look to, the kangaroo court system that's happening with Iraq right now, which is where hundreds of ISIS fighters have been executed. And obviously Iraq is extremely, there's no remorse given at all for any of the fighters, which is very understandable. But it is troubling when people are being sort of tried in 1 minute, and they don't have legal representation and don't have an argument to kind of stand on, and yet they are being sentenced to death. And I think that is troublesome, and it's also it's a very different dynamic, say, to Syria, where the SDF has these jails full of ISIS fighters, and they're really struggling to keep them in there because they don't have the resources or the money to even sort of instigate any type of legal process. And then that would possibly have to go through the Assad regime, or the US doesn't want to be involved in it. So there are two very broad dynamics there. But I definitely, as much as a lot of these people will tell you that they adhere to Geneva Conventions and that they don't instigate torture, I think that is largely not adhered to the best of their ability. And there's extreme emotion surrounding the issue too. So for Iraqis who feel that they've had to lose so many loved ones and have given up so much over the past 6 years, there is certainly no love lost when an ISIS prisoner is brought in or sentenced to death. But it is difficult because we want to know that there is accountability and justice are important, but the justice has to be carried out in a way that we can feel somewhat comfortable with. And I definitely have my discomfort with how a lot of it has been carried out.
Did you come across any foreign fighters?
Absolutely. There are many foreign fighters and many foreign wives. I spent quite a bit of time interviewing one particular guy he was from Sweden, and he spent was explaining his sort of whole travel process and how he kind of came through Syria initially, and when ISIS was sort of still Al Qaeda, and then it branched off, and then he pledged his allegiance. And so a lot of them were very open to talking to me, and including women from Germany and from other Western countries. And I think that was because they really needed, no one from their home governments had come to visit them, and I think that they were just sort of fed up of being held in these giant jails or displacement camps. And so their only recourse, I think, was to speak to a journalist to hopefully get their message out there, and hope that in some way, shape or form that they would be able to go home and face a court of law there for their role. And I think a lot of them were prepared to do that, but there was no open dialogue at that point with anyone from their country. And so in speaking to me, I think that they wanted to express that they were ready to go home and face whatever was waiting for them in terms of legalities.
So you sort of answered this question a little bit before, but what most surprised you in general that you came across?
I just think it was the I think sometimes we look at terrorism, in a very much a black and white prism here, and we tend to view it as being solely religious extremism that drives people to join these groups. And really what I found there in terms of locals, that it is a factor, but it's not the factor. And a lot of the times people were joining these groups because it was pure survival. So if ISIS comes into your village and you're just a poor farmer, and they take over the farm that you're working at, and you still need to make money and feed your family at home, maybe you're not going to care so much where that money is coming from, or maybe you fear, any sort of retribution if you decide that you aren't going to pledge that allegiance. So I think it's a really complicated issue, especially for the poorest sort of echelons in Iraq that really were trying to get by and very much had nowhere else to go and didn't have much of a choice but to put their support behind their groups to get the money. And there were just so many factors that came into it. There's religion, there's education, there's social pressures, there's just this idea that, one ISIS fighter I met was simply trying to run away from a bride. It had been an arranged marriage, and he didn't know her, and then found that she couldn't have kids. And so he was trying to run away, and he said he couldn't go north. So he went to get some land, and he, went into the ISIS battlefield. So I didn't find a lot of them to be, I found a lot of them to sort of be these kind of fake religious zealots, if that makes sense. So when I would talk to them about religion, it was sort of this brainwashed indoctrination, but it was kind of disingenuous, that they were just kind of spouting off what they were told to say, but I don't really think that they believed it. And so I think it's just a really nuanced, so many nuanced reasons as to people joining, and also just the idea of a Shia government coming to power and persecuting them. And a lot of them it was built up anger for feeling persecuted after the fall of Saddam Hussein, that they wanted to kind of fight back. And so I think it's such a nuanced thing. And that's really what surprised me, that you can't peg it solely on religion.
Mm-hmm. What was there a particular question or issue that you were really trying to get to the bottom of, and maybe felt like you did? Maybe any aspect of what you looked into, or maybe there's something you'd still really like to get an answer to?
I think for me, I was always deeply captivated by the situation with the Yazidis, and they're just these sort of very poor, innocent people that were living on Sinjar Mountain and the villages around it. And then just one day, just one moment, they were living their normal, very peaceful lives. And the next day, this sort of group had surrounded the mountain, and they had nowhere else to sort of run to. And any mechanisms that had been put in place to protect them had all run away and gone. And that was just devastating what had happened. And thousands of them had been taken. The women and girls had been taken as sex slaves. And a lot of the boys had been taken and brainwashed and forced into being child soldiers. And a lot of the men were just executed. And it's horrific to think about it. And you won't meet a Yazidi who doesn't have at least a dozen family members who are dead or missing. And that was always heartbreaking for me. And so a lot of the work I kind of wanted to do each time was trying to understand how many were missing, how many were brought back, and where a lot of the missing girls were. And I think prior to the fall of Mosul, there was a sense of hope that maybe a lot of the girls and women would be found and returned to their families when the liberation happened. And it kind of didn't play out that way. So I always wanted to kind of understand, well, what happened to a lot of the women and girls? And what I did find was that so many of them had been, especially the younger ones, boys and girls, had been given these new identities, and they were given these Arab identities, and taken with families. And so they kind of lost a sense of self of even who they were. And then a lot of them were taken into other countries like Turkey or Syria. And so what makes it really difficult to find them, and when you can't find them by their name, and you can't and a lot of the boys were in jails as ISIS fighters, and when you can't get in there and get the DNA, it's extremely frustrating for families and for people that want to try to rescue them. And so that's something I've always continued to try to work on, is try to figure out what role I can play in bringing awareness to the issue, so that a lot of these girls and women and boys can be found, and hopefully brought back and returned to who they're supposed to be.
Yeah, it strikes me as sort of a variation on genocide, more like a cultural genocide, where you either kill them all or just transform them into something different, like you say,
Yeah.
identities. So
Yeah, and when you're young enough and you're impressionable enough, it's that the brainwashing is really heart-wrenching, and so often the boys would be coming back too, and out of these ISIS camps, and there really wasn't the professional resources for them, and so they were still very angry and very in this sort of fighter mode, and would still refer to themselves sometimes with their Arab names instead of their Yazidi names. And in one situation, there was a young boy at a camp who tried to behead his baby sister, and it was so horrific to sort of think that they'd been through so much and been brought back, and yet it was just so hard to bring them back in a psychological sense. And that was I can only imagine how the mothers must feel and how deeply painful that is.
mhm. Also the issue of systemic rape, it's such a part of war, unfortunately, and it seems like it's no exception here, but I can't tell if it was worse in this situation than in other wars, or if it was, the same. You see it all the time. So I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's only really been in the last I think it was 98 that sexual violence was even sort of recognized as a war crime. So it's still relatively new, despite the fact that it has been happening since the beginning of time. I think what's different about this case is the Yazidis really shattered taboos, and it was really the first time I've ever seen groups come out and very openly talk about what had happened to them. And especially in these very closed and conservative societies where there is just so much shame surrounding the idea of sexual violence, and women and girls will never talk about it because they can be ostracized from their own families. And that's really sad. But what we saw with the Yazidi community was that they were coming out and they were talking about what happened to them, and their religious leaders were really standing up and saying, to their families, like the girls here are the victims, they aren't to be punished or persecuted based on what has happened to them. And I think the Yazidis wanted to see justice for what was done to them, and B, try to break some of those taboos in the hopes of stopping this from happening again. And it was remarkable for me to see how willing they were to talk about these horrific things.
Mm-hmm. And I also think something else I think people don't think about or talk about much, I don't know if you came across it, not systemic rape of men, but I think male prisoners are also raped quite often.
Yeah, and that's been something I've worked a lot and sort of tracked a lot of, especially in Syria, throughout the war in Syria, which has been going on for more than 10 years now. And so I mean, the sort of stories that have come out of those prisons there have just been so disturbing to me. The level of torture and rape, and again, it's extremely difficult for boys and men to be able to come out and talk about these things. And I could write a whole book about that too. But I think things are slowly shifting. I've definitely met survivors that are coming out to share their stories. I think it's going to take a little bit more time, but it is something that it's happening. It's still happening, and it's horrifying.
Yeah. It's it's a horrifying situation, and it's good that you're willing to go out there and bring these stories back. What this might seem like a strange question, but what did you enjoy most about your experience?
And that's the odd thing about covering conflicts, is there is so much that you learn to love and enjoy, and there are such pleasant moments in all the madness and the chaos too. And I think for me, I was just blown away by just how strong or how extraordinary ordinary people can be, and this kind of resilience. And who am I to ever complain about my life and what I do, when I'm just sitting with these most remarkable human beings who's been through so much and have left their homes, sometimes time and time again, and are able to get by, and they'll give you the clothes off their back if they can. And it's a real honor for me to be able to be able to walk into people's lives, and for them to share the most intimate details of what they've experienced with me, in the hopes that I can spread that to a broader audience and send back a rough draft of history. And that is something I take an extreme, I don't feel pity, because these people don't need pity. What they need is somebody to sort of support them in that way. And I'm really honored that I have had this opportunity in my life to be, I guess, bear witness to a lot of these pivotal things in history, and to really forge deep connections with people in far-flung places that I would never have met otherwise. And so there's so much learning. There's the food and the cooking and the singing and just being part of the sort of the celebrations. And they're just little moments of life that I deeply treasure.
Do you think at this point right now, March 2021, does the West still care about this situation, or is it become one of those back burner stories like, yeah, we're not at war with them anymore, we defeated them, whatever, let's move on? Like, what's your...
Sure. I think from a policy level, I think for obvious reasons, we will always have to have some form of engagement in the Middle East, whatever that looks like, and it's always going to be a part in shaping our foreign policy. I think, ISIS obviously has fallen a lot from the headlines, and there's been a lot of other things. We have a global pandemic, we have China, we have issues in so many, Iran, and so many different fronts that we contend with. But I've always been very perplexed by, I guess, sort of the media conglomerate, in the way that there's this long-running idea that world news, that Americans don't care about world news, and world news needs to be on the back burner. But when you present these stories to people, and when you give it a great placement on a website, or make it a segment in news, or really sort of, I guess, put it in front of somebody's eyes, Americans will read it, and Americans do care. And I've just been blown away by the generosity of Americans, and how many emails I get sometimes asking, how can I help these people? What can I do? And to me, that's extraordinary to me. So I think we need to give more credit to the American audience about, what it is that they are interested in learning about. And I think I would love to see some of these stories get better placement. And I think people will read them when it's in front of them. And there's just this kind of lingering idea that people are only going to click on the clickbait. But I think people do care. And I would like to see the news a little bit more accessible to everybody.
A little bit of a technical question. When you did your interviews, did you audio record, or did you just stick to writing?
It really depended. Most of the time I stuck to writing, because I never want to be too reliant on technology. So often when I was going into these places, I didn't even take a laptop. I just went in with my phone and maybe a burner flip phone as well, because for safety reasons, I think it's a lot easier to break into someone's laptop than it is for a phone. So I was always very aware of that. I also wanted to be as light as possible, really just getting around with a backpack as much as I could. And so that meant as little tech as I could. And yeah, I guess I'm just old school in the way that I approach my journalism is still very much the old-fashioned notebook, and that's really something valuable to me. I think there's a certain intimacy with it. Having said that, there were some interviews that I did record just because for clarity reasons, or if they were officials, I wanted to kind of not be, looking down so much. But when I had the opportunity to sit with people in their homes or on the front line or wherever it was usually just my notebook and me, because I wanted to just to kind of converse with them and have a very different experience. I think people can open up to you a lot more when they feel that every word isn't being grasped. And so I think that's also a nice thing about, not always having a camera around either, because I think that second that people see a camera or a recorder, they tend to clam up a little bit. And my objective as a writer was to really draw out as much truth and authenticity as I could.
Did you bring a still camera with you?
No, everything was iPhone. So which is actually great too, because when I was able to get to Wi-Fi or to a decent enough connection, what I did was I would upload a lot of the videos or the photos or whatever else I took or notes to a kind of a Dropbox shared file. So it was sort of safe in a cloud somewhere. So therefore, if I had to delete anything or if I lost my phone or anything kind of like that happened, it was already backed up. So you always hear the horror stories of people taking your USB sticks or your memory cards when you're leaving in an airport, which a lot of foreign countries like to do if they want to question the content of it. So you can sort of, take that, give that to them and know that your content is still safely hiding in the digital world somewhere. So I liked the simplicity of that approach.
Good. And I don't know, maybe you might not want to answer this question, but maybe you would. Was there any situation where you just totally broke down, like you were interviewing with someone that it was just too much for you to take what you were hearing?
Yeah, and that did happen a couple of times, and that was that's always hard because you want to maintain your composure as much as you can. But again, I'm always a human first before I'm a journalist. And I think one memory that sticks to mind is being with the Yazidis and sitting with them and with one of their religious leaders, Baba Chawish, and a bunch of the men were on the floor. And I remember they were just showing me these horrific pictures of babies, Yazidi babies that were being burned on stoves by ISIS. And then some of the old men that had sort of been taken, and they were showing me these before pictures and then the after pictures of the corpses. And then when I saw the babies, I just broke down. And I think it was a combination of just so many horrific stories that had compounded, over the months and the weeks and the days, and just sort of looking at this and then just knowing that it was still going on 20 miles down the road from where I was sitting. And I felt so powerless to stop it. And I just remember just completely breaking down and then looking back up at these Yazidis, the people who were living this, whose own mothers and sisters and loved ones had all gone, and just seeing these expressionless faces. And it was just that point that you really realized that they had reached this place that was beyond grief. It was beyond anything that I could even begin to imagine. It was just this place of where nothing is going to, break you down anymore, because you've already seen and done and experienced it all, and you're so holding that. And I thought how tragic that was, that they'd sort of reached this place that I could only begin to imagine. And so that was really a difficult night for me.
So, so sometimes people will explain horrific behavior on, sort of, these kids grew up in a war zone and all they learned was violence and this and that. And, there's different explanations for why people commit evil acts like this. Were you able to sort of get to some understanding of why people did what they did? Or were there any instances where you just thought this is pure evil? Or I don't want to use black and white terms like that, but were there situations where it was just inexplicable, horrible stuff going on that you just couldn't understand where it came from? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's always a root somewhere where it came from, but yeah, I think you have to look at a lot of the acts that were committed. You're putting people in cages and burning them alive. You're feeding them to, animals. They are horrific things that are happening. And I think that it's okay to say that you can't make sense of things that don't make sense. And certainly I can try to make sense of the reasons why people pledge allegiance and why they join these groups, but I can't, for the life of me, make sense of that any sort of violence in that sort of brutal manner could be in any way, shape, or form for a higher power or for a higher cause. I think that is just pure and utter brutality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you hope the book will do for readers?
Just really hope to give people a really comprehensive understanding of what war does to people. And I ask this question a lot throughout it, which is, what is war? And it's so many different things. And I want to take people on a journey with me into that battlefield, and just to highlight what it's like to be a civilian caught in the crossfire and what the consequences of war are. And I hope that in painting this, in showing these sort of micro stories, so to speak, we can paint a very macro picture of a war without the sort of sanitized news articles and the statistics, but just take people along for that journey and give them that insight. And I just think it's important to factor these things in every time the United States might be considering going in or intervening in a certain conflict. And I think it's important to understand, is military the best course of action? What are the ripple effects? And we really have to question doctrine and question not only what our involvement does, but what the involvement does to the people on the ground. And is it for the right reasons? And, could we help them in a, maybe a more effectual way than boots on the ground type thing? So I just think to make those decisions, and it's all case by case, but to make those decisions effectively, we need to really have a deeper, understanding of what war does. And I think so often we don't really recognize what it's like to live day in and day out of a brutal conflict.
Yeah. Did you have any difficulties getting the book finished or published?
The difficulties in it was just, for time, it was time for me because I was working full time. I was still traveling a lot to a lot of places, not only in the Middle East, but I was going a lot to Afghanistan or Yemen or Africa or, parts of Asia. So it was timing. So I really had to carve out, chunks of time, often midnight till 3 a.m. and then be up again at 6. So it was a little bit just kind of slotting it in there. But I really loved the writing process. I loved being able to step outside, I guess, the sort of the rules of journalism and be able to sort of take that more narrative approach, which I really love to do, and to be able to paint things with, I think, a lot more detail than I often can as a journalist. So that was a very cathartic experience for me at the same time. In terms of publishing, I think initially there was a bit of rejection with it because I think people thought, oh, nobody cares about ISIS, or there are already ISIS books. But I always felt that, I fought for mine because it was different than a lot that had been written. A lot had been written throughout the sort of the peak of ISIS, and it was a lot more focused on the battlefield components and the policy components. And I guess what I wanted to do was to paint the chronological order of it, but also go back to the aftermath. And books like Hiroshima have always really inspired me because they go back, decades later, and they go back and they say, well, what is the situation now? And they take us through the lives of these people in Japan, the doctors and the priests and the different people, and highlight. And for me, I think that's important. And that's often what's lost, is this idea of the aftermath. So I wanted that to be a really important focus of my book too. So I continued to fight for it, and then was able to sort of publish equally under Jocko Publishing and D'Angelo Publications, and they gave me a great sense of creative control. And I think also a lot of people, previous publishers, had wanted me to really cut it down, and I rallied against that because every memo was there for a reason, and every person's story really mattered to me, and it was heartbreaking to think I would have to go through and delete a lot of that. So I held out for quite a while. And then was sort of really happy with being able to maintain that control and get the full story out.
Do you, in the book, do you have sort of a wrap up where you discuss your opinions on the U.S. or other countries' involvement in this situation, or do you just kind of leave it?
Yeah, I really wanted to. I know there was a lot of people that had wanted me to sort of interject myself in there a lot more and give more of an opinion, but I didn't feel that was my role. I felt that my role was as a journalist to insert myself in there to a degree as the narrator, but also this was their stories. This wasn't my story. This was for the people that were living through this day in and day out. This wasn't, and I think we've seen that's often a sort of a bit of a kiss of death in journalism now, is so much focus is around the journalists themselves being a story, or any endeavors they've done. And I always thought that I want to be on the fly on the wall. It's why I chose that profession, because to me, it was being able to be that vessel to bring other people's stories back. And my story is, it's not a memoir. This isn't about me. And I wanted to sort of maintain that balance. And I wanted it to be something that was apolitical, because I think there's so much polarization and so much partisanship and so many people with opinions and ideas. And I think that's great, but this wasn't what I wanted to do with this book. This was about the stories and the people.
What's your current writing project? Do you have one?
I'm working on a bunch of different things, but I have another book project that I'm slowly developing. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I'm really interested in the survival aspect of human beings, and just this idea of really ordinary people that survive extraordinary situations and the worst of what humans can do to each other. And I just, in an odd sense, I want to make it a somewhat uplifting book, because I think if these people can really pull out these extraordinary things from deep within, then I really think we as humans don't know our resilience and don't know our potential. And I think there's a lot we can learn from survivors.
Do you agree with, people often say war reporters are adrenaline junkies? Is that the case, or can you be a war reporter, and not be an adrenaline junkie?
Sure, I think that's it. It's definitely a stereotype, and it definitely applies to a lot of journalists, I'm sure. But more often than not, I think, a lot of the journalists I meet, especially the women, it's definitely not, it's not about the adrenalism. It's not so much of it, I think, for me personally, and for a lot of other people too, is you do become addicted to it, but it's not the adrenaline you become addicted to. For me, it's always, I become addicted to, you forge these very fast, tight bonds with people. And when you're in these very hostile situations, your fixers and their families and the people on the ground that protect you, they become your family. And so I guess in a way I become addicted to sort of having this kind of nuclear unit of people that I form these tight bonds with. And there's also a simplicity about being in war, where you're just focused solely on surviving and telling a story. And I think when it sounds a little cliche, but when your calling or your place or what it is that you're meant to be doing for that chapter of life, there's a lot of peace with that. So there's peace in the chaos. And so when I think I have to come back and remove myself from that, there is an anxiety, or there's the real life problems of the bills and the rent and all the little day-to-day things we deal with. And you crave going back almost to that simplicity, and you crave going back to a place where you feel that is where you're meant to be. So I think that's an internal struggle a lot of us deal with. And also to a certain degree, there's guilt. So I never want to, I get to go into these places and experience these things, but I also get to leave. And a guilt comes with that, because I know that a lot of the subjects and the people that I write about and talk to, they don't get to leave. They have to live with this sort of chaos day in and day out. And there really is no silver lining for them. So I think it is an extreme honor, but there's also a guilt associated with returning as well.
When you come back from these spots, do you ever feel sort of an impatience with people, in the West, as far as the little things that seem to bother them? Do you feel like, hey, there are bigger things to worry about?
I do sometimes. And I think sometimes we have a tendency, or I say we collectively, this sort of wanting to be, I think a lot of us have lost a lot of meaning in our lives. And so what I see a lot is people trying to be parts of movements, or jumping on sort of cancel culture bandwagons, or trying to be part of these kind of social justice movements. Some of them are important, but some of them aren't. And I just see that people are searching for meaning for their lives. And it's disturbing sometimes when that meaning can become a little askew. And so I do get a little bit impatient with that, because I think we are so lucky, and it's certainly an imperfect country, but we're also extremely lucky to be here compared to really most places on the planet. But I also, at the same time, I also recognize people's problems are real, no matter where they are. And everybody has struggles and difficulties, and I certainly don't want to be somebody who minimizes that too. I don't want to be the person who comes back from a war zone and dismisses everybody else's problems. I think it's also important to show compassion for everybody, no matter where they're coming from and what they're enduring.
So where can people find you online? You have social media, website?
Yeah, Twitter and Instagram I use mainly, which is the same handle. It's Hollie, HOLLIE SMCKAY, and also my website, which is holliemckay.com. You can contact me through there, and I also have a lot of my writing and things I share there too.
Okay, good. Well, that's all the questions I have. It's been really interesting. Do you have any parting words or thoughts?
I get the book. I'd love to hear your feedback on it. Please feel free to reach out to me, a messenger on Instagram or through the email, or write a review on Google. And I just always love hearing people's feedback and what speaks to them. And if there are certain stories that speak to you more, I'd love to hear about it.
Cool. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yes. In my next episode, I speak with Henning Hillman about French privateers and pirates of the 17th and 18th centuries. Bullseye my subscribe button to catch that episode. Thank you for watching this video version of Military History Inside Out. If you liked the episode, please subscribe and hit the like button. If you're looking for military history and general history, including true crime, please check out my YouTube channel, WarScholar, my podcast, Military History Inside Out, and my webpage, warscholar.org or militaryhistorypodcast.com. If you're looking for space history and the science, technology, and business of space, check out my YouTube channel, Spacewalks Money Talks, my podcast, Technology in Space, and my website, technologyandspace.com. If you're looking for fiction, including sci-fi, horror, fantasy, mysteries, thrillers, film history, gaming, and more, please check out my YouTube channel, Chris Alvarez Full Contact Nerd, my podcast, Full Contact Nerd Interviews, and my webpage, chrisalvarez.com or fullcontactnerd.com. Thank you for watching.